Welcome. My name is Ilan Stavans. It's a pleasure to have you all in this, the third of 6 events that are part of the speaker series, Point Counterpoint at Amherst College. The series is designed to bring to the campus and to the community at large different ideological voices, different voices that come from a variety of disciplines with unique political perspectives that enable us to understand the moment in which we live, the contradictions, the tensions, the challenges. This year, the topic is poetry and politics and poetry. And we have had already 2 wonderful speakers, David Brooks of the New York Times and poet Jericho Brown. Next week, we have the US Poet Laureate, Joy Arjo, followed by the sociolinguist, John McWhorter, and after that, the editor-in-chief, just retired of the Washington Post, Martin Barron. I want to say that this event is made possible by the seminars on Opposing Views Fund established by the members of the class of 1970, with continuing support from individual alumni and parents. And behind the scenes, but very important in orchestrating that everything goes well, are 4 colleagues of mine that have been instrumental in making all this happen. Austin Hewitt, Victoria Nardone, Christina Ledoux, and Marcus De Mayo. I thank them very much for their work throughout the series. It is my pleasure to have 2 distinguished guests today that represent 2 different disciplines, history and poetry, or history and biography, although biography really is an element that brings them both. I will start with Fredrik Logevall, who is the Laurence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard, at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Professor of History. And because every time that I introduce somebody, Fred, I give the place of birth and the year, I will say it for you as well, born in Sweden in 1963. And my other guest, well, let me first say a few more things. He is the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning volume, Ember of War, the fall of an empire and the making of America's Vietnam, 2012. And the recently published, just last year, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, among other books. My other distinguished guest is Jay Parini, the D.E. Axinn Professor of English and Creative Writing at Middlebury College, born in Pittston, Pennsylvania in 1948. As I said, a poet, a biographer, a novelist. He is also a screenwriter, the author of a variety of books. I have been a consistent reader of those books. And the one that is, well, the most recent one is one very close to my heart, Borges and Me, about Jay's adventure. It's a novelized version of Jay's encounter with the Argentine man of letters in Scotland that is being turned into a movie right now. And also Robert Frost, A Life, published in 1999, which is the reason why I thought of bringing these 2 giants together, Fred and Jay, would be so interesting. The topic that I hope to engage us today is the relationship between Robert Frost, the national poet for a long time in the United States, and President Kennedy, and in particular that moment in which Kennedy agrees to send Frost to the Soviet Union, and Frost meets Nikita Khrushchev, and on his way, Frost is already an old man, and on his way back, he says something that makes Kennedy and his administration very uncomfortable. They part ways, and years later, President Kennedy comes to Amherst and delivers a wonderful speech on October 26, 1963. That is the subject of a documentary put together by the Amherst class of 1970 that was just shown 2 days ago, The Last Speech, JFK, The Last Speech. And I just want to read, before we enter the first question, a few lines of that speech. It is about the tension between poetry and power. And President Kennedy says, when power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses, for art establishes the basic human truths which must serve as the touchstone of our judgment. The artist, however faithful to his personal vision of reality, becomes the last champion of the individual mind and sensibility against an intrusive society in an officious state. The great artist is thus a solitary figure. He has, as Robert Frost said, a lover's quarrel with the world, a lover's quarrel with the world. In pursuing his perception of reality, he must often sail against the current of his time. This is not a popular role. Let me start by welcoming both of you. Let me start by engaging you on the craft that you have mastered and is so central to our culture, the craft of biography. Jay, maybe I'll start with you. You've written a number of biographies. You are recognized for the quality, the way that you distill the life in those biographies. In the age, Jay, of appropriation, in the age when we are told that somebody else's identity is theirs and not ours, the biography gets mixed and usurps and maybe steals. Reflect on what it means to be a biographer, the dangers and the assets, if you can.
Well, I've essentially been a biographer my whole life because I've been interested in people's lives. I wonder how people get from A to B, let alone to Z, in the course of their life. And so as a young man growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I was looking around saying, you know, how do people get out of their hometowns? How do they find a voice? How do they deal with the fact that they're living in a nation and they're part of this big public body? How do you find an education? How do you, and especially if you're interested in writers, I was interested in Frost from a very early age. In fact, a colleague of mine today at lunch said to me here at the college, when did you first start being interested in Frost? And I said, I was not a boy who read anything, but when I was 14, my 9th grade English teacher gave me a group of Frost poems and said, I want you to go home, read these over the weekend, and I want you to come back with a paper on Monday. And I thought, oh no, I'm ruined. I hate poetry. This is a horrible thing to do to any boy. And I went home and I started, and I remember I put it off to the last minute. And then Sunday night, I took anxiously from the drawer this poem that began, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Well, it was actually that 2 lines that did it for me. I read it over and over again. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. And I thought, how is it possible for someone to write with such icy clarity about a situation confronting the darkness, you know, you're confronting death, you're confronting your own life and mortality, and man alone against this wilderness. And Frost is doing it. And so I began reading Frost greedily and crazily. And my parents said, we're going on vacation that summer with me, and said, well, where are we going to go? And I said, please take me to Vermont. I want to see where Robert Frost lived. My parents thought I was crazy. but we drove up, we went to Dartmouth College and around Breadloaf and looked around and I spent my entire life, my first job, I was at Dartmouth College. And that's when I began writing my life of Frost. The very first day I started as a professor, 47 years ago. I walked into my office was right near the library, and I walked into the rare books library and I said, "Have you got anything by Robert Frost here?" And the guy said, "Well, you know, you're in luck. We just got 200 plus volumes of his notebooks, and we have about 1,000 letters." And I thought, and so essentially I sat down to write. And I started interviewing friends of Frost, and I absorbed the life of Frost over the next 25 years, so that it became my life. And, you know, I've lived in all of his houses. I've taught him over and over again. And, you know, here I am talking about him with such excitement, but there's never, ever been once in my life, and I'm asked to talk about Frost endlessly, believe me. I never don't get excited to talk about Robert Frost, because he has a purchase on reality that with his language, an edge on reality, and his life was so unique. And I was interested in how he did this, how he managed to make poetry out of place. The most important sentence I found in Frost notebooks was one that I highlight in my biography. No one else ever saw it before. And the line is this: locality gives art. 3 words: locality gives art. And I think Frost and Kennedy understood the art of the local. They understood how they were both Democrats in the sense with a small d. They were interested in country people finding a voice. They were interested in the individual. Frost was he once said at a big dinner in Washington with Kennedy in front of him, "Yeah, I've been a Democrat my whole life, but I haven't been happy since Grover Cleveland left the White House." That was 1897, I believe. So I was interested in piecing that life together and many, many other lives. It got me interested in writing lives. Fred?
I want to now go to you, Fred, because you have been a historian of the Cold War, a historian of the Vietnam War, a historian, and the hat of the historian and the hat of the biographer share elements, but they are also different. This, if I understand, is your first incursion into, and you're not doing it modestly. You're going right to one of the titanic figures of the American political life. So, what does it mean to be a biographer for you in this?
Well, it's great that we're talking about this right off the bat, because I love this subject, and to listen to Jay is just a privilege on this, given what he's done. I think in a way I'm like Jay, in that I too have been in some ways a biographer my whole life. When one thinks about what's interested me since I was a kid, the books that have been on the side of my bed, and my wife can certainly tell you that there's always a stack of biographies, whatever I might be writing at the moment. And I think I've also found, Ilan, that in my histories, when I write about the actors, the decision makers, the presidents, the policymakers, and I can introduce biographical elements, I find, this is something that I think is really important in terms of understanding who they are. I put a lot of emphasis in my own history writing on contingency, on the role of human agency, I think more so than subterranean forces, which, to be sure, also matter in history, obviously, but maybe more so than some of my colleagues here at Harvard in the history department, wonderful scholars, all of them. I probably err more on the side or focus more on the role of human action. And so in a way, I think it's a pretty short step from that kind of history to this effort now to write a 2-volume, as they say, life and times of JFK. I'm also finding that, as you point out, Ilan, they're not the same. History is not biography. And I'm learning, I hope, as I go, to figure out those differences, to respond to them, to bring to the table my training as a historian, and then learn from people like Jay how to incorporate the biography.
Let me bring in Fred and stay with you for a second.
Okay.
A task that is very important to me, and that's the one of the translator. And compare it to the biographer. The translator gets very, very close to a text, almost seeing the texture of the letters themselves and catching the mistakes that an author might make. Maybe the closest that you get to a perfect reader, but frighteningly so. And on occasion, a translator has the temptation to fix a mistake that the author made in the original. So the translator book might be error-free because the original was not error-free. And I want to ask you, where does the subjectivity of the biographer stay? How does it get involved in the whole process of shaping the life of the biography? Are you fully conscious in writing about Kennedy where Fred Logevall's subjectivity, his own vision as an outsider coming to the United States, becoming as an immigrant, where that perception is? And I'd love really to take that opportunity, writing about an American president in English by somebody who was born outside the United States, for me is very significant.
Oh, it's great. I mean, I like to believe, Ilan, that I am looking at Kennedy, as I say in the preface to this first volume. I want to look at him straight in the eye, not up in veneration or down in condescension. So I'm trying to be true to the sources. I'm trying to see things from his own perspective. I'm trying to forget that he became president of the United States to the best of my ability. Of course, I can't do that completely, but I'm trying to write it in that regard. I hope I'm true to the sources. I hope I'm true to him. What you said at the beginning about a translator certainly resonates, because I will be writing about one of his, let's say his senior thesis, which became his first book. And I can see, as a historian, his senior, where he could have phrased this better and thought about that better. And of course, I don't do what a translator would do. I wouldn't have that temptation, but I can totally see what you're saying. The other thing that I would say in response to your question is, maybe it's the case. I don't want this to sound self-important or conceited, but maybe coming at this as a Swede gives me a certain perspective that somebody else won't have. My former colleague who's just passed, wonderful historian at Cornell, Walter Lefebvre. Walt wrote once that it can be hard to be a student of the system. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it can be hard to be a student of the system when you grow up in the center of the system. And so I want to believe that even though I've been in this country for a long time, I'm now a dual citizen, Sweden and the United States, maybe this perspective coming from Sweden, and then we lived in Canada after we emigrated from Sweden. I was in Vancouver, BC. Maybe, Ilan, it shapes my interpretation of JFK, which is a sympathetic interpretation overall, and gives me a certain perspective that perhaps somebody who as Walt would put it, grows up in the system wouldn't have. I'm not sure.
Jay, back to you. Let me ask you. You were emphasizing about the local, the way that Frost becomes of a place and presents that place. Frost is also mythical in that connection of isolating himself and having his farm. But the myth of Frost is that in his isolation, he might not always be the best farmer or the best man who's handling the life of nature around him. He builds his own myth in front of others. So I want to go back, Jay, to the question of how does a biographer present the life of a man who has built that myth? Is it to undermine it? Is it to stress it? Is it to look at it from different perspective? Take it from there.
Those are fabulous questions. And I can play off a little bit of what Fred said. He's going to look at, he looks at JFK, not hoping to tear him down or undermine him, not hoping to idealize him or put him on a pedestal. And I have strongly felt as a biographer, and I've written 6 or 7 biographies, that you have to write out of deep sympathy. You cannot write a biography except out of sympathy. And that means trying to see the world from the perspective of this person that you're working on, right? If you can't enter it fully. Now, that doesn't mean then once you get into it and you look at the facts and you examine the larger historical context and social context, that you aren't critical and sometimes say, oh, my dear, Robert Frost, how could you have thought this and behaved like this? But hopefully you're looking with sympathy at the whole life and you understand the anxieties. That's the thing. Once you work with any subject closely, you understand they're just like you. Mm-hmm. They come out of terrible anxieties. Frost said we all proceed on insufficient knowledge. And I don't think there's one of us that isn't proceeding on insufficient knowledge. And so as a biography, you are major league proceeding on insufficient knowledge, and you're trying to keep getting facts and more building up. But unless you're engaging in this in the most sympathetic imagination, you're going to get nowhere. That's just going to just the fact of biography. And second thing I will build on that is a biography, unlike a work of history, straight history, has to tell a story for sure. History probably does too. But a biography is a story. And you've got the facts, but they have to be combed in a certain direction. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And you can't go against that. You want to comb them in a certain direction. And I've often read, 5 biographies, 10 biographies of the same person. And they often seem like very different people. And it's because the biographers are combing the facts in different ways, being very selective in what they're looking at, bringing their own. I mean, the biographer can't avoid bringing his or her own prejudices, ideas to bear. It's not possible. You don't hide them. So I've never tried to hide those, I bring them to bear. And so Frost is a difficult man. He's creating the myth of Robert Frost. When he was living in England, he said to a friend, he wrote back to a friend, I'm coming back to New England and I'm going to become Yankier and Yankier. And he came back and he bought a farm. He went up to Franconia, New Hampshire, and the local farmers were furious with him. They said he was a lazy farmer. He wasn't milking the cows on time. The fields weren't being properly mowed. But Frost liked to have a farm in the backyard, as he said. And he was interested in the imagery and the metaphors of farming. And he was interested in the local community. But he created a myth of himself as the common man. Right? That's what he was.
Beautiful. Fred, going to you, and you feel free at any point to catch up on something that Jay said. But
yeah.
You want to do it?
Well, I just would say Jay's point is so well taken about, in a sense, what I think we're trying to do as biographers is we want to humanize our subject. It's I think a more elegant phrase than to say it's warts and all, which is another way, I suppose, of making the same point. But certainly with respect to JFK, I perceived early on in the research that he was a flawed figure, and as president, I think he made his share of mistakes. But I agree with Jay. I think that, and again, I'm new at this, but to approach the subject from a sense of deep sympathy, I think is important. I guess there's a danger. I don't know how Jay would respond to this, but you hear this from time to time, that it's impossible not to fall in love with our subjects, or that we tend to do that to too great a degree, or biographers tend to do that to too great a degree. I don't feel now that I've done that. No doubt there are some reviewers of the first volume, and there will be reviewers of my second volume who think I am too sympathetic to Kennedy. But I'm prepared to defend that. I think that as a president and also as an individual, I find him deeply sympathetic. But that point that Jay made about being committed to your subject, being still prepared to be critical, letting the evidence go where it wants to go, that is to say, the sources, the letters, the documents, the oral histories, critically important.
You don't go through, Fred, different moments in the process of writing biography of getting desperate with your subject? Is sympathy always a pure emotion, or there are moments where you say, I'm getting too close, I'm finding out too much, I wish I could still take some sort of distance? Anyway.
Well, I mean, Jay has to respond to this as well after I do, because he's been at this, and I'm so keen to hear how he would respond to this. You know, I suppose it's true. I might need to think about that one a bit more, Ilan, but I do think that I caught myself in writing the first volume and thinking that, or asking myself the question, am I getting too close? And am I seeing this too much from JFK's perspective, from young Jack Kennedy's perspective?
Right.
And somebody else looking at the same evidence might say, well, you know, he is a privileged elitist young man. He's a slacker. He doesn't take things seriously. He doesn't treat people very well. He doesn't treat his friends very well. He doesn't treat women very well, which is certainly true. But I conclude this is a theme in the book. And I think I'm right about this. I think he's a man who, from a young age, certainly from his junior year here at Harvard, treats serious things seriously. It doesn't mean he's always a great student, but he is somebody who thinks long and hard about important things, including in the late 1930s about democracy. Can it survive? What will be required of democratic leadership going forward? Not every 21, 22-year-old is all that concerned about that kind of stuff. And I think that's with him. So, yeah, I recognize the danger that you're talking about. I want to say that I've stayed on the right side of that, but you know, it's a challenge. I don't know. What would you say, Jay?
Well, I think we both dealt with subjects, Kennedy and Frost, who are on some level hard to love because they have such obvious flaws. The previous biographer on Frost was a guy called Laurence Thompson. He wrote a massive 3-volume biography of Frost, and he hated Frost. And he used the word monster to describe Frost, not once, but I counted 47 times in the 3 volumes. He called him a monster. And he said Frost was arrogant. He hated other poets. He was egotistical. He was lousy to his wife. He was mean to his children. He was always trying to promote his career. He had bad things to say about almost everybody. So there was a lot to dislike about Robert Frost. But when you step back a little bit and you start to see that the guy, I mean, he was suffering from manic depression clearly his entire life. And you'd have to be blind not to see what's going on. He'd spend 3 weeks in his bedroom with the shades drawn, not talking to anybody. At other times, he'd go out walking for like 2 days without stopping through the woods and talking. So we see a man who's trying to cope with his own weird psychology and physicality and everything, you know? And then there's the good sides to everything too. He was devoted to his family as well as horrible to them. And so it's a very complex portrait. And so I had sympathy for all of this, and yet I didn't deny that he was at times, you know, an egotistical poet who wished every other poet were dead, because he kind of did. He did horrible things.
Yeah, well, in that sense, just really quickly,
Sure.
You know, Kennedy, for all of his flaws, you know, he certainly didn't. He might have had his own shortcomings, but they didn't go there. And I think what's, you know, one of the things that I think speaks to the broader theme of this, Ilan, is, you know, Kennedy had a historical sensibility that I think is really important in terms of understanding who he was, an international sensibility. alone among the kids. He was interested, certainly in the older kids. He had a kind of romantic sensibility. He was interested in poetry, as I think we've discussed. Frost was a favorite of his. I didn't find, by the way, and maybe Jay knows, but I didn't find which particular Frost poems, resonated with the young JFK at Choate. But yeah, no, Jay's point is well taken, that these characters we write about have real flaws, no question.
Because the subject of this semester-long series and course is really poetry and power, of politics and poetry, I want to hear, Jay, what the politics of Frost as he navigates through life are, and what he ends up finding in Kennedy that both ratifies his sense of who he is, Frost, and also is convenient. He looks at Kennedy, he chooses almost Kennedy to be the person who's going to be president. And then he's close, he is the first poet to recite an inaugural poem in the way, but he forgets that, or he can't read it, and so he recites another poem. What are the politics of Frost? And let me add to this question, because I'm going to ask Fred the opposite question: how does Kennedy come close to poetry in general, and to the poetry of Frost? For young students today, you can think of Whitman as a rebel. You can think of Langston Hughes as a rebel. You can but thinking of Frost as a rebel is not that easy. It's not the first place they go. And yet, Kennedy stresses that Frost is the countervoice, the solitary figure. And he says that it's a lover's quarrel with the world. So go there, go in that direction, Jay.
Well, I think what Kennedy admired in Frost, and what is to be admired in Frost, is that he was always unhappy with the current state of affairs. He was miserable with everything that was going on. Interestingly, he was this working man, and he identified with the working men, and he absolutely refused ever to be thought of as a Republican. He really didn't like that at all. He said, I'm a Democrat, a Democrat, a Democrat, but this is a very wide tent, and I'm gonna work within this tent. And within the Democratic Party, he represented the individualist strain of this stuff, right? He represented the local strain. He believed in locality, in the ruggedness of the New England farmer. He believed in striving and working. He was obviously a man with a sense of community. He writes about community. But, and you look at a poem like Two Tramps in Mud Time. Here's a poem where Frost is the farmer and he's chopping firewood in spring, and it's during the Depression. Two tramps, in quote, come and they say, hey, Mr. Frost, let us cut, we're starving to death. Let us cut your firewood. And so Frost struggles with this. He likes to cut firewood. He doesn't want to help these tramps and pay them. But he said, you know what? Theirs is the better right. They need money. They want to do work for pay, and I will honor them for wanting to do this work. And he said, in the end, only when love and need are one are we really there. Love and need go together. But here he's saying, I'm going to give up my love of chopping firewood and let these men, I'll pay them to do the work because it's the Depression. Frost was very sympathetic to working people and their needs. Yet he was very anti-New Deal. There was his rebellion in the 1930s. He really disliked Franklin Roosevelt, and he wrote against him all the time. And his 1936 volume of poems, A Further Range, is full of anti-New Deal rhetoric, right? He said, I was afraid to be too radical when I was young for fear of becoming too conservative when old. And so he really ferociously, he said, I don't like the smarmy generosity of the New Deal. He said, I'd like it to be tougher and grittier and let people feel their own heft and their own responsibility. And I know he didn't like liberals, even though he was a Democrat. And so He believed in the power of the individual voice. He said the poet is a person who speaks to the nation because a poet lives by words. He stands by what he says, and he's careful about what he says, and he finds the appropriate metaphors, and he learns to live by metaphor. He said a person who isn't trained properly in metaphor shouldn't be let loose in the world talking. They're only going to cause trouble. And when I first heard that Kennedy speech at Amherst about 3 years ago, before the film about Frost and Kennedy that I participated in, I hadn't heard this speech. And I was quite, I'm not a person ever moved to tears, almost never. But there I was moved to tears. It was partly just to see a president speaking eloquently. 3 years ago in the age of Trump, when we're looking at a man who really, speaks like a fifth grader and he doesn't have the sensibility of my own 6-year-old grandson. He doesn't have the human sympathy and the perspective that my 6-year-old grandson has already. Trump is just, unfortunately, again, talk about sympathy. That's going to take a great biographer to write the real Trump biography. Because to have sympathy with that man is going to be very, very hard.
All right, I want to ask you just one more thing before I go to Fred. Very much, Frost is a man of his time. He's very critical of the New Deal. He sits in the kind of uneasy middle between the individualism that maybe the Republican side might have in confessing or professing his democratic passion. Could you imagine him today? Could you imagine such a figure breaking boundaries? Not in the time that he was, but anachronistically, Jay, transported to the age of Trump.
Well, I think he was transported because I think Frost's greatest poem is Mending Walls.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, something there is that doesn't love a wall. Yeah. And that's Robert Frost, doesn't love a wall. It's only the Stone Age savage who says, good fences make good neighbors. That's savagery. And so that poem is all down on the side of building community and not building walls. And so, this should have been the anthem in the age of Trump, Mending Wall, because that's the work of the poet, is mending walls.
Fred, there's so much in what Jay said
that
I'd love to get your reaction to. And I also want to hear from you the appeal that the mediocre student, Jack Kennedy, has for poetry when he's a young man, and he retains for poetry as he travels on. I was talking about the two of you and about the Frost-Kennedy relationship in my class, and there's an extraordinary Chinese student in the class who says, Professor, in my country, particularly in dynastic China, politicians have been poets. The prince, the monarch, were poets. This dichotomy of the poet on one end of the court and the politician on the other end of the court is Western and maybe very American. Anyway, Fred, you can do with all of that whatever you want.
Well, I think your student is onto something important, and this is where Kennedy's commencement address at Harvard in 1956 is so interesting, because which I write about in near the end of the first volume. Because what he's arguing, along the lines of what your student said, is that there's a schism in American society between politicians and intellectuals, that this needs to be closed as far as Kennedy's concerned. He reminds the audience in Harvard Yard that day about the fact that in terms of the nation's early years, the intellectuals and the politicians were often one and the same person, and that it was good for the country. And so I think he had a deep sense from childhood of what your student is puzzling over. And I think that was something that Kennedy himself perceived. It may grow in part out of his own interest, as you said, in poetry, which is there from a younger age. By the way, as a politician, his widow, Jackie, spoke to this after his death. he was not too keen on having people know that he was interested in poetry, which tells you maybe something about American politics, or at least where Kennedy thought voters and others would want him to be. So he certainly didn't trumpet the fact, but he had that interest.
But why? Let me just push you a little bit there. Is this because it would be seen as a form of weakness to be interested in poetry? Because a statesman doesn't waste time in such things, or why?
Yeah, you know what? I don't have a really good answer to you, because I wonder about this myself. I think he thought, Kennedy, that it would be perceived as effeminate, or as you say, not strong enough, not what a serious man should be concerned with, and that people would see it as kind of soft, that it wasn't something that one should really pursue. And so he doesn't, what that means is that he doesn't practice, in a sense, what he preaches in that 1956 address, although that, of course, is a public address, and he's extolling poetry. In fact, at one point he says in the address, I think it's near the end, and I'll just quote it. He says that a woman is, he quotes a woman who says, "Don't teach my boy poetry." An English mother wrote the provost at Harrow, "Don't teach my boy poetry. He's going to stand for Parliament." And then Kennedy says, "Well, maybe she was right, but if more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I'm convinced that the world would be a little better place in which to live on this commencement day of 1956. So here he is extolling this, and he's not trying to hide it. But Jackie, according to Jackie, there were other times when he was not too keen to articulate this interest of his, which went back to his childhood. He read poetry all his life. He had a great memory, so he would remember poets. You know, it's Frost, it's Alan Seeger, it's others, and I think they gave him insight, they gave him sustenance intellectually. I think he thought it was terribly important.
Jay, can I ask you, in President Kennedy's Amherst speech, he describes, let me use this adjective, beautifully, in an inspiring way, the poet as a contrarian, or almost as a biblical prophet who's capable of saying things that others will not say. And he says this is not a popular role, but somebody, for democracy to work, somebody has to take this role. But I say it's beautiful, and I say it's inspired, but it's also a trap, because not all poetry is born out of contrarianness. The idea that the poet needs to be a voice that is questioning power all the time entails the fact that the poet is not in power, but it feels to me somewhat facile, somewhat easy here, or maybe constraining the poet to always having an opposing side. What do you think?
Well, I always go back to Wallace Stevens, who in Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction said, in a poem called Of Modern Poetry, a very important poem, says a poet has to meet the people of his time, the men and the women of his time. He has to listen to the speech of his time. He has to talk about war. He has to talk about peace. So he has to, in other words, the job of the poet is to articulate a vision of the world that's both rational and moving and clear. And, so, when a politician does this, Kennedy could do it now and again. When Abraham Lincoln scribbled on the back of an envelope on his way to Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, and he read that astonishing poem in language, was hugely important for the people to this day, So, presidents can become poets in the right moment. I think Kennedy and Lincoln, the greatest poets, Jefferson, these people understand what Frost understood, which is that you have to seize the language, and you have to speak it. You have to address war and peace, pain and suffering, joy and grief.
It's so true. And just on this point, Kennedy, when the inaugural address was being drafted,
Mhm.
and they waited until pretty late. The whole thing was written just a few days really before the inaugural, but he instructed Ted Sorensen and others, go back to Lincoln's first, go back to or Lincoln's second, go back to FDR's first, go look at FDR's, look at Jefferson's first inaugural. I mean, he valued this. He saw the importance of this. It's one of the things that also attracted him to Winston Churchill as a wordsmith and as an orator. He understood, I think, what Jay is saying, which is that a president, at least on occasion, needs to be able to speak in a way that a poet would speak.
Yeah, it needn't be fancy or effeminate or anything at all. It just needs to be clear and profound, and the words have to be adequate to the emotions and to the situation.
Yep.
And so rarely are politicians' words adequate to the situation at hand.
Yeah.
You know, Fred, I was thinking when you were mentioning about the connection between intellectuals and politicians of a previous generation, them being one, and not the division that we have later on. I was reflecting in one of the classes that the earlier American presidents were many of them polyglots. They spoke 2 or 3 or 4 languages, because the education at that time meant that you would take Latin and Greek and biblical Hebrew in universities, in colleges, and but the closer we come to the present, and the closer we come to the last president in particular, and even the current president, speaking a foreign language, which could be also a way of entering poetry.
Oh, sure.
Foreignness of coming from the outside is less and less a fixture of the American political establishment. Although things could turn around, one never knows. But I'm thinking, going back to what Jay was saying and to what you were saying, Fred, of the moment in which we are, of politicians capable of using the fire, the sculpting of words to be able to just touch the truth in the heart. And it's the last 4 years were pretty tough. I don't, you're a historian, you're not a...
They were, you know, I'm reminded, of course, of John Kerry having to hide the fact that he could speak French when he was the Democratic nominee, that this was somehow perceived, certainly by Republicans who were eager to demonstrate the fact. But I guess he thought sufficiently large number of independent voters, and maybe some Democrats, somehow a knock against them, which I found you know, absolutely preposterous, and yet speaks to a kind of solipsism and a certain anti-intellectualism that courses through our body politic, and I think it's a problem. And so yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to is it's a sad reality, but it's where we are.
Yeah. Now, Jay, there's a moment in the friendship between Frost and Kennedy that turns that friendship into animosity. Frost goes to the Soviet Union. He gets sick. Khrushchev goes and visits him. He spends an hour or 2 in his hotel, in his bed. They talk at length. He admires the role that poetry has for the Russian people, and Khrushchev admires what Frost represents. But upon coming back to the United States, he opens his mouth, Frost, 87 or 86 at that time, in such a way that causes the Kennedy administration to feel, oh, a poet maybe should not be the one that is sent to another country and be an ambassador, even of goodwill. He causes more trouble. And one of the corollaries of that incident is that, poets are dangerous. Poets speak their mind. Poets will not align themselves with the administration's rhetoric. And for some reason, Plato exiled them from his republic.
Yeah. Frost was deeply, deeply hurt by Kennedy. It's interesting, though, that Kennedy's speech of dedication to the Frost Library comes after that.
Yeah.
And nevertheless, so obviously Kennedy forgave Frost, but Frost was pretty ferocious when he got back from Russia and wanted to try and spur Kennedy onward to stand up to Russia, right? He didn't like collectivism. He didn't like Soviet communism, and he was, had a strong view of these things. It's a great question. Should you send poets out into the world as politicians? I mean, think of Pablo Neruda, right? There's a great Chilean poet, possibly one of the great populist voices of the 20th century. And he was the Chilean ambassador to Paris. And he spoke for the people, right? So this would be the ideal. Populism could go that way, or populism can go in the Trumpian way. Where it's very ferociously anti-intellectual and sees the intellectual or anybody who uses language with sophistication as a threat. It's too bad that we've come to this impasse in America where intellect is seen as so threatening, and people with any knowledge at all are a little bit frightening to the population, which is, rather unfortunately poorly educated, and that's really a sad
one of the things, if I just may, on dispatching Frost to the Soviet Union, one of the things that's ironic about this is I think that at least part of the motivation, I haven't written this is going to be in volume 2 of my book, which, because the archives are closed, I'm a little bit stymied at the moment, but I'm doing some work on it. But it speaks to Kennedy, his decision to do this speaks at least in part to what I think is a very important part of Kennedy's foreign policy, too little written about. And so I intend to bring this out in the book, which is a belief in diplomacy, a commitment to negotiations, a belief that even in terms of the Soviet-American relationship, Cold War, you needed to have efforts at bringing the two sides closer together. You needed to find areas of common agreement. And I think he believed, with some justification, that sending a great American poet to a country that reveres its poets and is very interested in Frost, this is great. And of course, as you both say, it didn't go in the way that I think anybody maybe wanted. I think Frost felt badly afterwards. I think Kennedy felt badly for alienating Frost.
Right.
But I can see why, for Kennedy, a practical, shrewd politician, but also a poet or a lover of poetry, why he would send him. I think it's a remarkable story.
And it went over very well in Russia, by the way. They revered poets.
Oh, yeah.
I can remember years ago, I invited Yevtushenko to speak at Middlebury, and I had dinner with him, and I asked him about this. He said, in my childhood, it was like one of the great moments of my life. To think America loved us enough to send Robert Frost, whose poetry was widely known in Russia, translated into Russian. And so it was actually a very effective diplomatic move on the part of Kennedy.
Jay, I want to ask you, we are coming close to concluding this wonderful conversation. Being a national poet, next week I'm going to be in conversation with Joy Arjo, who is the U.S. Poet Laureate. It is not quite the topic, what does it mean to be a U.S. Poet Laureate? But the question that I want for you and for Fred is, what does it mean to be a national poet? It certainly elevates you, but it also can curtail your freedom or limit who you are because you have to represent. How do you achieve the status of a national poet? Is it by choice of people? I live in this wonderful town of Amherst where there are two industries and then others. One is Robert Frost, and the other one is Emily Dickinson. And yes, we do other things in Amherst, but they are the main figures here. What is a national poet, Jay?
I think it's a poet who catches the voice and the tone of a nation and speaks in a way in his or her poetry that people, when they read it, they see themselves reflected in it, challenged and inspired. And I think Frost did that for people. They read these poems, they were invigorated, they were challenged, Often it went against their own grain, but they liked the graininess of Frost, his irascibility. They liked the distinct individual human voice. And I think that's what that's why Whitman was a national poet. He contained America in his language. Emily Dickinson was a national poet because America could look at this and find a version of themselves. And that's what a national poet has to do. Hard to do, but I mean, the ones who do it really do it.
Fred, to you, I wonder if the romance of Kennedy with Frost, because that seems to me what it is too, a romantic relationship with all that it entails, is you think, and I'm here bringing the historian and the biographer into very present, the urgent and raw and uncomfortable present, is something of the past. Or you can see that intersection of the poet and the politician finding a common ground. We just had, of course, an inauguration with a terrific young African-American female poet, Amanda Gorman, but I want you to take it from there.
Well, I hope it's not of the past. I guess I would concede, Ilan, that it's not of the present, and it's not of the recent past. But I hope that we can reach a point, and I think we need to reach a point, where those words from Kennedy's 1956 commencement address that I referred to earlier, I just think it's one of his most important pre-presidential speeches, and I might even put it in the top 6 or 7 of his speeches overall, including his presidential speeches, because I think it speaks to something that's so important about, yes, poetry and power, as you're saying here. And it just, in terms of their relationship, Jay made a point earlier that I just wanted to underscore, which, this part of Frost, which was not satisfied with the status quo, I think is something that resonated with Kennedy. And that's something that he himself felt. I think it's partly what drove him forward, in addition to ambition and a certain lust for power, I'm sure. But it's also this. I think that spoke to him in Frost's poetry. Interestingly, he was also not particularly a fan of FDR, so they had that in common. Kennedy also didn't really like being called a liberal, even though he was a loyal Democrat. And in many respects, he was liberal in his policies. But just hearing Jay talk about Frost, I thought, that's Kennedy. So, but I worry that, to go back to your question, that we're not in a moment now where you could have, as you put it, a romance between the president and a poet. We're not there.
Jay, last words on these different topics?
I would just say that this has not been a good age for poetry, but Frost is a poet leading us back, like Kennedy is leading us back to the living language, the waters of language. And I always, someone told me once that Kennedy loved that late poem of Frost's, Directive. And the final lines are about poetry itself, I think. Here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole beyond confusion. And I think that's what we need. This is our watering place right here now, talking about this, reading Frost, thinking about Kennedy, going back to the second inaugural, the Gettysburg Address. Here are our waters and our watering place. And I think we got to keep always drawing the nation, ourselves, our students, our friends, back to this living stream.
Fred, last words?
I think that's beautifully put. And it's just been an absolute pleasure for me to be with the two of you and to have this conversation. And I think we should do it again. This is great. Thank you.
Really
enormous.
Fred. Lovely, Fred.
Lovely to have both of you. Thank you very much. And I want to remind everybody that the video of this will be up in about 2 or 3 days, and that next Thursday at 7 p.m., the U.S. Poet Laureate Native American J. Arjo. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.